Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith. Matt, this week we are talking about probably one of the most controversial topics for any resident of Mokena, wouldn't you say?
I would say so, yeah.
It is the story of our name.
Yes.
And we're going to try to get as close as we can to solving this mystery in this episode.
Absolutely.
So why is there such confusion about our name?
So you ask anybody from Mokena what Mokena means, and they say it is a native word for mud turtle. And I can 100% with zero doubt in my mind whatsoever tell you that it does not mean that. As we will see, as I will go into detail, if I had to make a bet on this, I would say Mokena just means turtle. Nothing with mud.
Okay.
I think I know where the mud came from, though, based on yet another story about the origin of Mokena's name. And I think that over the years, they just kind of melded into one thing after repeated tellings. And I think then it just sort of stuck as mud turtle. But
turtle, I mean, turtle has, we kind of see turtles here and there around town, different, things will use that. But so we think turtle's probably good. Yeah. But it's the muddy part. We don't want to be muddy turtles.
Yeah, no. There's zero evidence whatsoever on the historical record that there's anything having to do with mud. I would embrace it if I could find any sort of corroboration for it.
Okay.
But it's just not there.
Well, this is interesting. We get into some detail, kind of cover each of the different kind of theories or ideas behind the name. So again, it's a very interesting story. So let's get into it.
What's in a name? A name can tell us a lot about someone. When the shell of mystery around a name is cracked, we can recognize heritage, the era in which a person has lived, even a thing or two about the giver of a name. Names can also evolve over time. For example, it is very common that a child goes by one name in his early years, but takes a completely different one in adult life. Villages are also no exception to this rule. When one turns back the pages of our local history, such places as Van Horn's Point, Frankfurt Station, New Bremen, and Sedgwick appear. While these towns have grown to become respectable, solid Midwestern communities, respectively known now as New Lenox, Frankfurt, Tinley Park, and Orland Park, a few neighboring hamlets have died out altogether. Does any reader or listener in 2023 remember Chelsea, Spencer, or Alpine?
So, Matt, tell us real quick.
Yeah.
Where is the origins of, you said that Van Horn's Point, which is now what we call New Lenox.
Yes.
What's the origin of Van Horn's Point?
The origin is after the Van Horn family, who mostly lived closer to what is today Frankfurt, actually. But I believe, and I'm not an expert on New Lenox's history, so maybe someone out there is and can tell us, but I believe Van Horn's Point might have been named after Cornelius Van Horn, who was a prominent citizen of what actually would become Joliet, and I believe he was their first mayor. I believe it was named after him, but a lot of the Van Horns lived actually closer to today's Frankfurt.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how about Sedgwick too? Orland Park was known as Sedgwick?
Sedgwick, that one I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know where Sedgwick came from.
And then you talk about Chelsea, Spencer, and Alpine.
Yeah.
And what's the story there? Where did they go?
A lot of interesting stories with them. So Chelsea started out as a rural post office that was the first post office established in what is today Frankfurt Township back in about 1836, 1837. In there, it was established by a man by the name of Levi Clays, who kept it in a little country store that he kept. It was probably the first business in what is today, once again, Frankfurt Township.
We're at Any idea where that would have been considered today?
Yeah. I would, if we don't know 100% for sure, but I would hazard a guess that Levi Clay's Chelsea post office was somewhere roughly nearby, close to the vicinity of where Lincoln Way East is nowadays.
Okay.
Because a couple decades later, or I should say by a couple decades later, like by around the time of the Civil War, he owned a fair amount of that section over there. And around the time Mokena was born in 1852, maybe just a few years before, like end of the 1840s, the Clayses, Levi and his brother Charles, had a village platted out there. And that the village plat still exists at the county recorder's office. That stood exactly where East is, where Lincoln Way East is.
Oh, wow.
But nothing ever really came of it. It was platted out and they were trying to sell some lots. And then as all this was going on, the Rock Island was built through Mokena, or what would become Mokena. And any sort of business that was looking to move into the area went straight to Mokena.
Okay.
So, yeah, Chelsea never really took off. There were stories that the few buildings that may have been there were, by the time of the end of the Civil War, moved to Mokena and Frankfurt. But yeah, it was never really equaled anything like Mokena or Frankfurt.
Yeah, wow. Interesting.
Exotic sounding names often lead to rumors and mistaken truths. For despite local folklore, the true origins of the word Mokena are deeply shrouded in mystery. Norma Lee Brown, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, who canvassed the town for interesting stories at the end of World War II, found an interesting take on the village's namesake. In her 1945 work, Mokena Memorabilia, Brown wrote, "The old-timers say the town was named for a great Indian chief named Moki, McKinney, and diverse other variations." Longtime resident Clinton Krause remarked a few decades ago that he was also told the word trickled down from the name of a certain Chief Moki, an Indian leader who centuries ago lived where Mokena now stands. As interesting as the story sounds, Krause admitted he had no idea how authentic it was, although he was quick to note, "We always liked to believe it was true." Taking as Chief Moki's name might be, historians have never given this story much credence. Another spin on this tale was told around 1960 by pioneering local historian Florence Pittman. In gathering information for her booklet, The Story of Mokena, Pittman came across an anecdote from the early days about a small but determined group of Indians who lived not far from town. Although the majority of their brethren left this part of the state in the late 1830s as a result of unfair treaties with the United States government, a few Potawatomi hangers-on lingered in this part of Will County. Having gained a healthy sustenance from a huge slough that existed somewhere northeast of Mokena, this group of Native Americans insisted that the word Mokena meant mud hole in their language. While she was a very talented writer who presented an account that wasn't far-fetched, Mrs. Pittman forgot to include any references or sources as to where exactly she heard this account. Therefore, modern historians have had extreme difficulty in pinning down the authenticity of the story.
So, Matt, you talk about this booklet that Florence Pittman wrote about Mokena.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, The Story of Mokena. It's a good one.
So where can people read that today? Do you know?
Yeah, there are lots of copies that are still floating around out there. I would say your best bet is to go to the Mokena Library.
And
they have it.
Is that something, I mean, how in-depth is her booklet about Mokena?
It's pretty in-depth. She breaks it down into, I wouldn't really say chapters per se, but more like sections, like on the founding families, the McGoveneys and Denneys, and then the story of the Rock Island Railroad. She talks about early businesses, the story of how Mokena's first water tower was built, goes into the churches, different clubs and organizations that have existed. So it's a nice reference work. She did her homework on it. She talks about lots of really interesting stuff that only pops up there.
And this is written, you said, shortly after World War II, right?
Yes, the story of Mokena was put out. That must have been around 1960 or maybe even as late as 63. The one that came out right after World War II was Mokena Memorabilia, which is like another booklet, more in kind of like a magazine type format, I would want to say. It's actually illustrated with photographs as Florence Pittman's story of Mokena. There are pictures, but they're all sketches by local artists. But both of those can be had at the library. Yet another take on the meaning of Mokena was related by editor William Semler of the News Bulletin in 1930. In the columns of his newspaper, Semler wrote that Mokena resident Milton Kropp had recently found himself doing some plumbing work at the summer home of a rich Midlothian man in Wisconsin. While there, he had become acquainted with some members of a local Chippewa tribe, who, upon learning the name of Mr. Kropp's hometown, told him that a trench or foxhole-like dugout was known as a Mokena in their mother tongue. Be it a feared and respected tribal leader, a muddy swamp, or a place of shelter during war, perhaps the most bizarre explanation for the meaning of Mokena can be found in the brittle and fragile pages of the October 11th, 1910 issue of the Joliet Weekly News. On that day, a feature titled Mokena Doesn't Need a Copyright ran, and aside from providing us with countless historical gems on the town's early days, the unknown writer boasted that the name Mokena is associated with poetry, being taken from The Veiled Prophet of Khorasan by Tom Moore. Today we know that Irishman Thomas Moore wrote Lalla Rookh, an Oriental romance, in 1817. In this work of poetry, a character named El Mokena makes an appearance as the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, and interestingly enough, a routine check of facts shows that El Mokena was most likely based on a real figure named El Mukena, a Persian prophet who led an anti-Arab rebellion in his homeland around 776 AD. El Mukena's name translates to the Veiled One, who, according to which story you hear, concealed himself due to his beauty, the fact that he was battle-scarred and one-eyed, or that he was severely burned in an explosion that occurred in his line of work as a chemist. After having poisoned himself while under siege by his enemies, his followers kept up his sect until the 11th century. How did El Mokena become connected with the Mokena of 1910? Could an early settler of Mokena have been a fan of Thomas Moore's poem? Or perhaps the fact that El Mokena and Mokena were connected was simply an invention of a Joliet newspaper editor looking to spice up his story? Any answer to these questions has long since faded into history. With our hindsight now in the year 2023, we can spread every theory about the meaning of our town's name on an imaginary table in front of us. We can critically review and analyze them. When this is done, there is one theory, one story, and one piece of evidence that sticks out above the rest. The historical puzzle pieces snap together just nicely enough to make a theory seem believable. That is namely that the word Mokena comes from an ancient Algonquin term meaning turtle. In his seminal 1881 tome, Discovery and Conquests of the Northwest, DuPage County historian Rufus Blanchard included a respectable list of American place names whose origin could be traced to the first Native American residents of those regions. Among such words as Milwaukee, Minnesota, and Mississippi, the term Mokena appears, almost as if by afterthought. Peering into this fragile antique work, the reader notices a phonetic pronunciation of the word, a brief note signifying its Algonquin root, and a town in Illinois, Turtle. Blanchard's factoid does make sense. The Potawatomi natives that Frankfort Township's first white settlers encountered spoke a language that belonged to the large Algonquin family. Even more interesting is the fact that linguist Michael McCafferty of Indiana University, states that American Indians often named geographical features for a prominent aquatic animal living in or near its waters. As if more convincing was needed, early surveyors of what would later become Frankfort Township noted vast areas of swampland not far from the future site of Mokena. Could it be that these pioneers encountered a turtle or two in the swamps, and for curiosity's sake, had asked a Potawatomi the name in their language for these shelled reptiles? Well, very believable. Determining the correct spelling and pronunciation of any Native American word is next to impossible, this being due to the lack of a written language and a dire shortage of fluent speakers. As such, Associate Professor Edward Callery of Northern Illinois University, today's preeminent expert on Illinois place names, concludes that our fair village's name stems from the Algonquin Mokena, from which the Tazewell County village Mackinac name could also be taken. A similar word, Mokena, also denoting turtle, exists in the Potawatomi tongue, not to be outdone by Mikenak, or snapping turtle in the closely related language of the Ojibwe. The cold hard fact is, no one really knows for sure what Mokena means. While early historian Blanchard presented a very sound theory, no living person can give any explanation complete certainty. The sole reasons for this are simply because modern-day researchers have no idea who exactly gave our village its rustic name, or even if it predates the 1852 founding of Mokena. It's not out of the realm of possibility that the word Mokena, or some variant thereof, has been used for centuries to describe this location. All in all, maybe it doesn't matter. Like a champion resting on his laurels, we can look back at nearly 170 years of proud history onto a village that has not only shaped its region, but has also survived the tides of time. We can pride ourselves on the fact that we are one of a kind. Our community is unique in the United States. For every city, village, municipality, and hamlet in the land, we are the only Mokena.
I think that last line is pretty cool.
Thanks.
And the fact that we are the only Mokena.
Yeah,
There's no other
true.
Mokena in the United States.
There is not.
Or anywhere else, as far as we know, right?
There's not. No, definitely
So,
not.
is it unusual? Do you know? Is it unusual for us for villages in the area or around to not know the origins of their name?
I'm not sure, really. I feel I like to look up place names because they interest me. I can't think of any time where I've ever really looked one up and not come back with something. So I think it must be pretty uncommon.
Yeah.
I heavily lean towards the Algonquin language. It's there's the various variations like Mikenak and things like that. It definitely is a word that exists in these native languages, and we have a eminent historian saying that it was common for native tribes to name features after aquatic animals. So I think that's the most likely one. Every once in a while, someone asks me what Mokena means. I just say, to cut down on the long story, I just say it's turtle in Algonquin. Yeah.
And so do you know what the earliest reference, like in print, was?
Yeah. The earliest reference to the name is Rufus Blanchard's book from the 1880s.
Referring to us as Mokena.
Yes, referring to Mokena meaning turtle. In his, do you mean it?
As far as maybe the first time in print, or that somebody was calling this place Mokena.
Yeah. Let's see. The earliest possible references would probably be Alan Denny's original plat of Mokena, which he completed as the Rock Island was coming through, which was filed with the county in 1852.
Wow.
There's no reference before that. That's why I kind of posit, oh, well, maybe it's been around for centuries. But and then that's another one of the things that kind of complicates the whole issue, is that we don't know who gave Mokena this name. Was it Alan Denny? Was it the Rock Island when they decided they would build a depot here?
Well, that's interesting. What if Alan Denny just heard the word in conversation and he said, let's call it Mokena?
Yeah, which is entirely possible. That could very easily have been what happened.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, right. It's all speculation, I guess, at this point. But
yeah.
interesting to think, we just kind of take it for granted, although a lot of people, you get out of the, southwest suburbs and might not even, a lot of people haven't heard of our town, Mokena.
No, they definitely haven't.
Really interesting.
It is. It's one of the most interesting little tidbits, I think, about Mokena's history is our name and its origin, and
absolutely
all that fun
adds
stuff.
A little bit to the mystery of it, right?
It does, yeah.
Well, good. Well, this is a neat story, a fun story. I think we've cleared up that there's no mud relation to our name here.
That's right.
So anything else you want to add before we close this out, Matt?
No, that's well, maybe one thing, if you're interested in Illinois place names, you can check out, I gave his name, it was Edward Callery of Northern Illinois University, wrote a really, really cool book maybe 12 or so years ago. I believe it's just called Illinois Place Names. And you can look up hundreds and hundreds of Illinois place names, and he really did his homework on all of them. So
wow.
So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you could check the book out and spend some time paging through it. It's really interesting.
Very cool. Well, we'll be sure to share, as always, share the address to the blog article for this one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So that you can go through and read that if you want, as well as get the references for the different places that Matt talked about. Make sure to check out that book by Florence Pittman, which is available at the Mokena Library.
Yes.
And Matt, thanks again for sharing the story.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're enjoying our show, it would really help us out a lot if you would leave us a rating and a review, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as share our show with your friends and your family. There's a link in the show notes to Matt's blog article that this episode was based on, so be sure to check that out. If you have any ideas for a show or have any questions we can try to answer, please send us an email at MokenasFrontPorch@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and hopefully answer your question on the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.